The morning of his wedding, Alex Mercer stood in the pristine silence of Elena's study, a room that had always felt more like a stage set than a place of work. Sunlight streamed through the tall bay windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the sleek modern furniture and the framed accolades that lined the walls. He was searching for a misplaced cufflink, a simple, frantic task that felt absurdly mundane against the grandeur of the day that awaited him. His fingers brushed against the spines of leather-bound books on her shelves, titles on philanthropy and ethical leadership that now seemed to watch him with silent, mocking eyes. It was a slight unevenness in the grain of the mahogany bookshelf that caught his attention, a panel that sat just a fraction of an inch too proud of its neighbors. A gentle push revealed it was not fixed, but a cleverly concealed door. His heart, already thrumming with the low-grade anxiety of the day, gave a single hard knock against his ribs. Inside the shallow cavity, nestled alone in the darkness, was a simple black ledger. He lifted it out, the cool, pebbled leather foreign against his skin. He told himself it was an old financial record, something mundane, but the deliberate nature of its hiding place sent a cold trickle of foreboding down his spine. He opened it. The pages were filled not with the dry figures of corporate accounts, but with a meticulous, handwritten chronicle of deceit. His eyes scanned the entries, his brain struggling to assemble the numbers and notes into a coherent, monstrous whole. Here were donations to children's hospitals, the sums publicly celebrated, with a second column detailing the percentages quietly siphoned back into Elena's private accounts. There were lists of workers' names, their agreed wages slashed in half, the difference pocketed with a cold notation: efficiency savings. Most chilling were the records of deals with small, family-run contractors, partnerships Elena had praised as community building, now revealed as elaborate traps. She would agree to terms, let them invest everything, then use hidden clauses and fabricated breaches of contract to seize their work without full payment, driving them into ruin. The ledger fell from his trembling hands, hitting the plush carpet with a soft thud. The room seemed to tilt, the sunlight now feeling harsh and exposing. He saw her then, not as the radiant woman he was to marry in a few hours, but as she had been over countless dinners when he'd asked about her work. The slight tightening around her eyes, the elegant deflection, the way she would take his hand and say, "It's just the stressful world of business, my love. You wouldn't understand." He had mistaken her secrecy for the burden of success. He saw now it was the guile of a predator. A wave of nausea washed over him, so potent he had to brace himself against the bookshelf. The trust he had built, brick by careful brick over 2 years, shattered in an instant, leaving nothing but a cavernous void inside him. The woman he loved, the philanthropist, the community pillar, was a carefully constructed fiction. The scent of her perfume, still lingering in the air from the previous evening, now smelled like poison. On the day meant to be the beginning of their life together, Alex Mercer stood alone in a room of lies, the foundation of his future crumbling to dust beneath his feet. The silence of the study had become a physical weight, pressing down on Alex's shoulders as he stood frozen amidst the ruins of his trust. The ledger lay at his feet, its pages splayed open like a wounded bird, the handwritten figures seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. He left it there, stepping back as if from a contagion, and retreated to the guest bathroom down the hall. He needed distance, a space untainted by her presence, where he could try to assemble the shattered pieces of his mind. Locking the door, he braced his hands on the cool marble of the vanity, hanging his head as a tremor ran through his entire body. The initial shock began to curdle, transforming into a hot, sharp fury that burned in his chest. It was a rage not just at the betrayal, but at his own blindness. He saw every tender moment, every whispered promise through a new horrifying lens, each one a calculated move in her elaborate game. The image of her, soon to be walking down the aisle in a gown of pristine white, sent a fresh wave of revulsion through him. His first visceral instinct was to storm into her room, to confront her privately, to scream the truth into her beautiful lying face, and watch the mask shatter behind closed doors. He lifted his head, and his own reflection in the mirror gave him pause. The man staring back was a stranger, pale, with eyes shadowed by a storm of emotion. He looked like a victim, hollowed out and broken. The private confrontation would be cathartic, a release of his own searing pain. But as the specifics of the ledger replayed in his mind, the siphoned charity funds meant for sick children, the stolen wages from workers struggling to feed their families, the deliberate ruin of honest contractors, his personal heartbreak began to feel like a small selfish thing. This was not just about him. A private reckoning would allow her to control the narrative, to spin excuses, to perhaps even silence him before the truth could ever see the light. It would be justice for him, but not for them. He leaned closer to the mirror, his breath fogging the glass. The grief in his eyes was slowly being supplanted by a cold, hard resolve. The scale of her deception was not a personal failing. It was a public crime. The victims, the people whose lives she had casually dismantled for profit, deserved more than a whispered accusation in a hallway. They deserved a witness. They deserved accountability. The grand spectacle of the wedding, with its gathered crowd of influential guests and hovering media, was not a perversion of their union anymore. It was the perfect stage. It was the one place where her carefully constructed world of lies would be most vulnerable, where the truth would land with the force of a detonation. His jaw tightened. The trembling in his hands stilled. The man in the reflection was no longer a betrayed fiancé. He was an instrument of reckoning. The love he had felt was now fuel for a different, more demanding purpose. His personal pain was a fire, and he would let it burn, not in a destructive rage, but to forge a blade of justice. He would walk down that aisle. He would stand before the priest. He would wait for the moment when all eyes were upon them, when her triumph seemed most assured. And there, in the heart of the celebration she had built on a foundation of exploitation, he would tear it all down. The decision crystallized within him. A cold, unyielding diamond formed under immense pressure. Justice, he understood with a grim finality, would have to override his pain. The quiet hum of the office photocopier was a stark, mechanical counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of Alex's heart. In the pre-dawn gloom of the building where he worked, a place normally filled with the chatter of colleagues and the clatter of keyboards, he moved like a ghost. The ledger lay open on the glass plate, its damning pages illuminated by a sweeping green light. With each pass, the machine whirred and spat out a duplicate, a paper ghost of Elena's crimes. The scent of ozone and warm toner filled the small windowless room, a smell that would forever be associated with this clandestine act of rebellion. He worked with a methodical precision, his movements economical and sure, a stark contrast to the tempest raging in his mind. Each copied page was another brick in the wall of evidence he was building, a wall that would soon collapse onto the elaborate stage of their wedding. He avoided his own office, the place where Elena's smiling photograph still sat on his desk. Her calls, which began as cheerful check-ins laced with excited anticipation, now flashed on his silenced phone with a persistent, accusing light. He watched the screen illuminate and then go dark, over and over, a silent testament to the chasm that had opened between the man he was supposed to be today and the man he had become. He maintained the facade, sending back brief, reassuring texts. Just tying up a last-minute work thing. Can't wait to see you. The lies tasted like ash in his mouth, a bitter mimicry of her own deceptions, but they were necessary. The calm he projected was a thin veneer over a roiling sea of tension. Back in the empty silence of his apartment, the wedding suit hung in stark, elegant isolation. He laid the photocopied pages out on his bed, a mosaic of betrayal. He began to practice, his voice a low murmur in the still room. He spoke not of love and forever, but of diverted funds and broken contracts. He rehearsed the cold, hard facts, stripping them of emotion, letting the numbers and the names speak for themselves. He timed his words, measured his pauses, envisioning the sea of shocked faces. This was not a lover's quarrel. It was a prosecutor's opening statement. The strategic power of the truth was its simplicity, its undeniable weight. It needed no embellishment, only a voice to give it air. His final act was one of concealment. He carefully folded the most incriminating pages, the ones detailing the gutted charity donations and the ruined contractors, and slipped them into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. The fine wool, which had felt so light and celebratory when he'd first tried it on, now seemed to hang on him with the grim purpose of a bulletproof vest. He adjusted the jacket, feeling the slight papery rustle with every movement, a constant physical reminder of the secret he carried. His mind raced, a whirlwind of contingency plans and imagined outcomes. He saw Elena's face, first confused, then horrified. He saw the guests, the gasps, the chaos. But overriding it all was the clear, sharp image of the victims, the anonymous workers, the struggling families, the cheated charities. They were his anchor in the storm. Their truth, now hidden against his heart, was the weapon he would wield. It was no longer about revenge, it was about restoration. And as he stood before his own reflection, the man in the suit ready for his wedding, he knew he was prepared not for a beginning but for a reckoning. The air in the chapel was thick with the scent of gardenias and the low, reverent murmur of anticipation. Sunlight streamed through the high, arched, stained glass windows, casting pools of jeweled color across the faces of the assembled guests. Every pew was filled, a sea of silk and summer suits, of soft smiles and misty-eyed relatives. The string quartet in the corner began the first, trembling notes of the processional, a piece Alex had once thought was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. Now it sounded like a funeral dirge. He stood at the altar, his posture unnaturally rigid, his hands clasped so tightly before him that his knuckles were bone-white. The fine wool of his suit, which concealed the damning evidence against his bride, felt like a suit of armor, heavy and constricting. He had plastered a smile on his face, a careful, practiced expression that felt like a grotesque mask. It was a performance more demanding than any he had ever given, each second stretching into an eternity of excruciating tension. He could feel the weight of the photocopied pages in his inner pocket, a cold, papery shard of reality against the feverish dream of the ceremony. Then the great oak doors at the rear of the chapel swung open. A collective, soft gasp rippled through the crowd. There she was, Elena. She was a vision in a cascade of ivory, silk, and lace, her veil a diaphanous cloud framing her face. She seemed to glow, illuminated by the adoring gazes of everyone present. On the arm of her beaming father, she began the slow, stately walk down the aisle, her steps perfectly measured, her smile radiant and untroubled. She was the picture of bliss, the culmination of a fairy tale, and to Alex she had never looked more like a stranger. His false smile remained fixed as she drew closer. He could see the details now, the delicate embroidery on her bodice, the way her eyes sparkled with happy tears, the genuine joy that seemed to emanate from her. It was a masterclass in deception, so flawless it made his stomach clench. His own heart hammered a frantic, traitorous rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of panic and resolve. The ritual of it all, the music, the flowers, the expectant faces, was a beautiful, elaborate lie, a gilded frame around a rotten portrait. Her gaze found his as she reached the end of the aisle. Her father placed her hand in his, and her fingers were warm, trusting. For a breathtaking moment, her happy, tear-filled eyes locked with his own determined, icy gaze. In that split second, he saw the woman he had loved, the future he had dreamed of, and it was almost enough to shatter his resolve. But then he felt the subtle rustle of the papers hidden against his chest, and the moment passed. Her smile softened, a private, loving look meant only for him, completely unaware that the man standing before her was not her groom, but her executioner. The music faded. The priest began to speak. The ceremony, a ritual perfectly masking the turmoil churning just beneath its serene surface, was underway. The moment hung suspended in the chapel's perfumed air, a fragile bubble of tradition about to be popped by the pin of truth. The officiant, a gentle-faced man with a voice like worn velvet, smiled benignly at the assembled guests before turning his gaze upon the couple. He spoke the ancient ceremonial words, a question woven into the fabric of countless unions, one that was almost always met with a respectful, predictable silence. Therefore, if anyone can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be married, speak now or else forever hold your peace. A customary pause followed, a breath held by the entire congregation. It was a moment for coughs to be stifled, for nostalgic smiles to be shared. But the silence did not hold. A single sharp intake of breath came from the groom. Alex's posture, which had been rigid throughout the ceremony, now seemed to solidify into something more formidable. He released Elena's hand, the warmth of her touch lingering on his skin like a phantom brand. His movement was deliberate, unhurried, a stark contrast to the sudden tension that electrified the air. Every eye in the chapel followed him as he took a single step forward, turning to face the crowd. From the inner pocket of his suit jacket, he drew forth the folded sheaf of papers. The soft rustle was deafening in the hushed space. He unfolded them with steady hands, his gaze sweeping over the sea of confused, expectant faces before settling on the photocopied script of Betrayal. His voice, when it came, was clear and resonant, devoid of the tremulous emotion of his vows, carrying the cold, hard weight of fact. He began to read, not from a prepared speech of love, but from the ledger's meticulous records. He named the children's hospital, the one Elena had so publicly championed at galas, and recited the exact sum donated, followed by the smaller, real figure that had actually reached them, the difference neatly embezzled. He listed the names of workers from her manufacturing wing, their agreed-upon wages and the slashed amounts they had actually received, his voice etching their financial suffering into the stunned silence. Finally, he detailed the case of a small, family-owned construction firm, describing how Elena had lured them in with a promising contract, allowed them to invest their life savings, and then used a fabricated breach to seize their work without full payment, driving the patriarch into bankruptcy. A wave of gasps erupted not all at once but in a rolling tide of disbelief and dawning horror. The idyllic atmosphere shattered, replaced by a thick, choking tension. Whispers swelled into exclamations. Heads turned not toward Alex, but toward the bride. Elena stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her grasp. The radiant color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the marble statues flanking the chapel doors. Her eyes, wide with shock and confusion, were locked on Alex, searching his face for some sign that this was a cruel, unfathomable joke. The truth did not dawn on her slowly. It crashed over her in a single devastating wave. The carefully constructed persona of the philanthropic businesswoman, the identity she had worn like a second skin, was being publicly flayed away, leaving her exposed and raw. Her lips parted, and a single breathless whisper escaped, a thread of sound that carried through the sudden quiet that had fallen as Alex finished speaking. "How could you?" The words were not an accusation of his methods, but a raw, wounded plea from a woman who had just seen the entire architecture of her life, both public and private, collapse into ruins. It was the catharsis of public truth, brutal and absolute. And in that moment, the wedding was no longer a celebration but a trial, and the groom was both witness and prosecutor. The pristine silence of the chapel shattered into 1,000 dissonant pieces. The single breathless whisper from Elena was swallowed by a rising tide of noise, a cacophony of gasps, shouted questions, and the scrape of chairs as guests surged to their feet. The orderly rows of silk and summer suits dissolved into a chaotic mosaic of agitated movement. A woman near the front, a major donor to one of the named charities, stood and pointed a trembling finger at Elena, her face a mask of outraged betrayal. A man across the aisle, a business associate, roared a denial, his voice straining to be heard over the growing tumult. The air, once sweet with gardenias, now crackled with the raw energy of scandal. Security personnel who had been discreet shadows at the periphery now moved with grim purpose, wading into the fray. Their attempts to restore order were futile against the swell of emotion. They formed a protective, struggling cordon around Elena, who remained statue still at the altar, her veil now looking like a shroud. Her family descended upon her, a flurry of panicked whispers and protective arms, shielding her from the accusing eyes and the sudden intrusive flashes of light as journalists, tipped off or simply drawn by the commotion, began to appear at the chapel doors. The romantic spectacle had morphed into a public implosion, broadcast in real time. Amidst the storm, Alex stood his ground, the photocopied pages now hanging limply at his side. He was the eye of the hurricane, a pocket of strange, cold calm. Two security guards finally reached him, their grips firm on his elbows. There was no struggle as they began to escort him down the side aisle, away from the main chaos. He did not look back at Elena, at the ruined altar, or the weeping flowers. Instead, his gaze swept over the scene he had orchestrated. The arguing guests, the frantic media, the crumbling of a carefully constructed world. A complex, bitter cocktail of emotions churned within him. There was vindication, a sharp, cold satisfaction seeing the truth land with the force he had intended, seeing the mask torn away, and the victims, at least symbolically, avenged. But it was a hollow victory, immediately tempered by a profound and aching sorrow. This was the room where he was supposed to have begun his life, surrounded by friends and family. Now, it was a monument to betrayal and destruction, and he was its architect. He had wanted justice, but the reality was messy, painful, and stained with the grief of a love that had been real to him, even if it had been a lie to her. As he was led out into the startling brightness of the afternoon, the sounds of the wedding's collapse echoing behind him, he carried with him the heavy, immediate fallout of his shaming, a victory that felt devastatingly like a defeat. The digital wildfire began before the last wedding guest had even fled the chapel. A blurry, frantic video shot on a smartphone from the back pew was the first spark. It showed the precise moment Alex stepped forward, the confusion on the officiant's face, the first gasps of the crowd. Within an hour, it was everywhere. News alerts blared across screens, their headlines designed for maximum impact. Wedding revenge, I do expose you. Groom's vows vanish, bride's crimes revealed. The story was a perfect storm, wealth, romance, and spectacular downfall, and the media feasted upon it with an insatiable hunger. Alex, sequestered in his lawyer's austere office, watched the storm unfold on a muted television. The screen flickered with images of the chaotic chapel exit, of Elena being shielded by her family, her face a pale mask of shock. Pundits debated the ethics of his public shaming on daytime talk shows, their faces animated and judgmental. He gave a series of carefully managed interviews, his demeanor calm and resolute, his words meticulously chosen. He never spoke of his own heartbreak, never mentioned the personal betrayal. Instead, he focused relentlessly on the facts from the ledger, stressing the need for restitution for the charities and the workers. This was never about revenge, he would say, his voice steady, his gaze direct. It was about returning what was taken. It's about accountability. As Alex became a reluctant, sober-faced symbol of justice, Elena's reputation underwent a public execution. Her glossy corporate headshots were juxtaposed with the grainy wedding video, the contrast damning. Former colleagues gave anonymous quotes, suddenly recalling her ruthless efficiency. But the most powerful blows came from the victims themselves, emboldened by the public exposure. A local news station tracked down the owner of the ruined construction firm. The man, his face etched with weary resignation, stood in front of his shuttered business and confirmed every detail Alex had read aloud. A former employee from one of Elena's factories gave a tearful interview about being forced to choose between medicine and groceries after her wages were slashed. Each story was another nail in the coffin of Elena's public persona, transforming her from a celebrated philanthropist into a national pariah. Alex faced the dual-edged sword of this newfound fame. Supportive emails flooded a newly created public address, many from strangers praising his courage. But the backlash was equally fierce. Online forums seethed with commentators accusing him of cruelty, of a monstrous lack of chivalry for destroying a woman on her wedding day. He was called a narcissist, a control freak, a man who loved the sound of his own moralizing voice more than he had ever loved his fiancée. He read these comments late at night, the blue glow of his screen illuminating the weary lines on his face. The public opinion was a fickle, roaring beast, and he had fed it a feast. It was lapping up the drama, but he wondered if it truly cared about the justice he had sought to serve. or if it was simply entertained by the spectacle of a beautiful lie being so brutally dismantled. He had traded his private life for a public platform, and now he had to stand upon it weathering both admiration and contempt, a man trapped in the very storm he had chosen to unleash. The courtrooms became the new theaters of their shattered lives, sterile chambers where the raw emotion of the wedding chapel was distilled into the dry language of affidavits, motions, and procedural objections. The media storm, once a roaring hurricane, settled into a persistent drizzling rain of legal reporting. Lawsuits filed in rapid succession by the defrauded charities and the bankrupted contractors formed a formidable phalanx against Elena. Her legal team, a polished and expensive group hired in a frantic bid for damage control, moved with the slick precision of seasoned strategists. They filed for delays, challenged the admissibility of the ledger, and attempted to frame Alex's actions as those of a vengeful ex-lover, his evidence tainted by personal malice. But the evidence was a mountain that could not be moved. The photocopied pages from the ledger were just the beginning. Subpoenaed bank records traced a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts, a paper trail that meticulously corroborated every handwritten entry. Forensic accountants hired by the plaintiffs picked apart Elena's financial history with surgical skill, revealing the intricate architecture of her deception. Each disclosed document, each sworn deposition from a cheated worker or a baffled charity director, added another layer of irrefutable fact to the case against her. The legal walls were closing in, not with a dramatic slam, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier. Alex's role shifted from public accuser to key witness. He spent days in stuffy conference rooms, rehearsing his testimony with lawyers who treated him like a piece of vital, if emotionally complicated evidence. When he finally took the stand, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. He spoke calmly, his gaze steady as he recounted the morning of the discovery, the chilling contents of the ledger, and his decision to expose it. He was cross-examined aggressively by Elena's lead attorney, who tried to paint him as unstable, vindictive, a man who had chosen the most brutal possible path out of wounded pride. Alex weathered the assault without flinching, his answers focused and clear. He repeatedly steered the conversation away from his own pain and back to the victims, the specific sums of money, the named individuals, the tangible harm. His testimony was not about his broken heart. It was a clinical, devastating map of her crimes, drawn for the sole purpose of charting a course toward compensation. The pivotal moment came during a preliminary hearing, when Elena was required to make a brief court appearance. The vibrant, radiant woman from the wedding was gone, replaced by a subdued figure in a simple dark suit. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the plaintiff's attorney outlined the staggering scale of the financial malfeasance. When the judge addressed her directly, she lifted her head. The defiance and shock that had characterized her at the wedding had melted away, leaving behind a profound, weary remorse. Her face was pale, the lines of stress around her eyes visible even from the back of the room. She did not speak, but her posture, the slight tremble in her lower lip, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of the accusations, it was a silent, powerful confession. This was no longer a performance for the public or a battle of wits with Alex. This was the raw, unvarnished consequence of her actions, the cold reality of accountability being meted out not in the court of public opinion, but in the solemn, unforgiving theater of the law. The spectacle was over. The reckoning had truly begun. The silence of her penthouse was a different kind of noise, a heavy, accusatory hum that filled the spaces where congratulations and wedding music should have been. Elena sat on the floor of her walk-in closet, her back against a wall of empty shelves, the scent of cedar and abandonment thick in the air. The lavish gown was gone, returned by her mortified mother. The jewels, the gifts, the trappings of a life built on a beautiful lie, all were being catalogued for liquidation by her lawyers. All that remained was the crushing, suffocating weight of the truth. It was no longer something outside of her, reported in headlines or argued in courtrooms. It had seeped into her bones, a cold, permanent resident. This was guilt, not as a fleeting emotion, but as a state of being. Her mind, once a sharp instrument for calculating risk and opportunity, now replayed her actions on a relentless, torturous loop. She saw not the clever schemes or the justified business maneuvers she had once told herself they were, but the human wreckage in their wake. The image of an elderly volunteer at the children's hospital, her face creased with a grateful smile as she accepted a ceremonial check, now made Elena flinch. That smile had been for a fraction of the promised sum. She thought of the contractor, a man named Ben Carter, whose hopeful, trusting eyes during their initial meeting she now recognized as the look of a man about to walk off a cliff she had designed. The greed that had driven her felt like a fever dream, a possession by a stranger whose cold logic she could no longer comprehend. The ledger had not just been a record of financial crimes. It was a map of her own moral decay, and she was now forced to walk every corrupted path it charted. One name from that ledger burned brighter than the others: Maria Flores. She was a seamstress in the manufacturing wing, a woman whose entry in the ledger was a simple, brutal notation of a halved wage. Elena found the woman's address in the old personnel files. Driving there, through parts of the city she only ever saw from the insulated interior of a luxury car, felt like a descent into a world she had deliberately ignored. Maria's home was a small, neatly kept bungalow with a struggling vegetable garden in the front. Elena stood on the porch for a long moment, her hand poised to knock, her heart hammering with a fear far greater than any she had felt in a boardroom. The woman who opened the door was small and wiry, her face a roadmap of long hours and quiet resilience. She recognized Elena immediately, her eyes widening not with anger, but with a deep, weary shock. Elena did not try to explain or justify. The words that came out were simple, stripped bare of all her usual eloquence. She apologized. She stated the exact amount of wages she had stolen, the specific months, the direct impact her greed had likely had. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply offered the truth, an amends as stark and unadorned as the woman's own living room. Maria listened in silence, her arms crossed over her chest. When Elena finished, the woman simply nodded, a single, slow movement that held a universe of sorrow and dignity. The children needed new shoes that winter, she said softly, and then she closed the door. The quiet click of the latch was more devastating than any screamed curse. It was the sound of a door closing on a part of Elena's own soul. Back in the cavernous silence of the penthouse, she picked up her phone. Her fingers trembled over Alex's name. He was the architect of her downfall, but he was also her only link to the person she had been before the greed had taken hold, the person who might have been capable of love without calculation. She typed a message, deleting and rewriting it a dozen times. It was not a plea or an excuse. It was a simple, stark offering. I am sorry for everything. I am selling it all. I want to make it right. She did not send it to win him back or to ease her sentence. She sent it because the act of reaching out, of acknowledging the pain she had caused him directly, was the first trembling step out of the prison of her own shame. Redemption was a distant, perhaps unattainable shore, but guilt was the current that was finally pulling her toward it. The restitution fund was established with a clarity of purpose that felt like the first clean breath after a long illness. Alex worked with forensic accountants and the lawyers representing the victims, creating a transparent channel for the return of every embezzled dollar, every stolen wage. The process was methodical and unemotional, a balm against the raw drama that had preceded it. Donations began to flow in from unexpected places. Former wedding guests horrified by their proximity to the scandal, anonymous benefactors moved by the victims' stories. But the most significant contribution came from Elena herself. News reached Alex through his lawyer that she had initiated the liquidation of nearly all her assets. The penthouse, the luxury cars, the portfolio of investments, all were being sold. The proceeds, a staggering sum, were being transferred directly into the fund. It was not a gesture, it was a gutting. She was dismantling the very empire she had built on deceit, brick by gilded brick. They agreed to meet one final time, not in a lawyer's office or a courtroom, but in a public park. a neutral territory under a vast, indifferent sky. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. He saw her from across the lawn, sitting alone on a bench, and the sight of her still sent a complex jolt through his system. She was thinner, the elegant sharpness of her features honed by stress into something more fragile. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple, unadorned garments that made her look like a stranger, or perhaps more like the person she might have been all along. He sat beside her, a careful foot of space between them. For a long moment they watched the gray squirrels chase each other around the trunks of oak trees, their simple, frantic lives a world away. She spoke first, her voice quieter, stripped of its former polish. She did not speak of the legal battles or the media, but of Maria Flores, of the children's hospital, of the specific human costs she was only now beginning to fully comprehend. She told him about selling her possessions, the strange lightness she felt as each item of her old life disappeared. It was not a performance of penitence. It was a report from the front lines of her own ruin. Forgiveness hung in the air between them, a palpable, unspoken question. He could feel the weight of it, the expectation that this was the natural end to their story, the villain redeemed, the hero magnanimous. But the chasm was too wide, the foundations of their relationship too poisoned. "I can't give you that," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not the forgiveness you might want. What you're doing, it's right. It's necessary. But my forgiveness would be a small personal thing, and this stopped being personal a long time ago." He was not being cruel. He was being honest. The path to amends was hers to walk, with or without his personal absolution. She nodded, a single slow dip of her chin, her eyes glistening but dry. She had not expected it, and in a way, his refusal to offer cheap grace was its own form of respect. It acknowledged the true scale of the damage. Their goodbye was not an ending wrapped in a neat bow, but a bittersweet severance. There were no embraces, no final, lingering touches. There was only a shared look that held the entire painful history of their love and its destruction. The joy that had been real, the betrayal that had been deeper, and the grim, painful growth that had been forced upon them both. He stood, and she remained on the bench, a solitary figure in the fading afternoon light. Alex walked away, the crisp air filling his lungs. He did not look back. His future was no longer tied to hers, to the wreckage of their shared past. It was dedicated to something new, something built on the bedrock of the ethics he had been forced to defend so violently. The repair was imperfect, the closure incomplete, a vase glued back together with the cracks still visible. But it was solid. It would hold. He moved forward, not into a fairy tale, but into a life of purpose, carrying the lessons of the pain they had both endured and inflicted, a man forever marked but no longer broken.